Make sure I don't got an echo here, and we ought to be good. All right. Welcome to 420 TV. I have a guest, Mike Huberty, if I'm pronouncing that right.
That is correct.
Like
Nope, you're right. Better than puberty.
Right. I was checking out on Twitter and I came across his show and I realized he has a whole plethora of shows talking about the paranormal, everything from UFOs to ghosts. And I just thought the whole concept of See You on the Other Side was like a really great concept. And I like to,
sure.
I'm sorry. I had a little glitch here. Anyway,
right.
And I wanted to invite you on to go ahead and talk about how you got started with that and how your music kind of turned into a podcast and what got you into the subject of the paranormal there.
You bet. I've always been interested in the paranormal. Growing up, whenever they would have any kind of ghost story on a show like Ripley's Believe It or Not, the original one with Jack Palance, or That's Incredible, I'd always be super interested in like the real life stories that were happening. And that was just something that really captivated me, just beyond I always enjoyed fictional stories and of course science fiction and horror and everything, but there was just something about the real life stories that like captivated me. And so I remember when I was a kid, so I was like in junior high when the story about the Beast of Bray Road came out.
Yeah.
And so the Beast of Bray Road, if you guys don't know, is there's a small town between Milwaukee and Chicago. And so Milwaukee and Chicago about an hour and a half away from each other. So about 80 miles. And so on the Wisconsin-Illinois border, a small town called Elkhorn. And what was happening was that people were seeing what looked like a wolf man, kind of like walking on two legs, a giant dog or something, walking on two legs, red eyes. They were calling the cops. People were seeing this in the middle of the night. And they were terrified. So they called what do you do if you see something like that? You're like, this might be an escaped animal from the zoo or, something like you call police.
Some kind of weird chimera or something, right?
Right. But if you think something's in actual danger, right, to the world around you, and you're like, oh my God, this is real, then you're going to call the people who are going to come take care of it. And the police, well, they went to check it out, and the police weren't, finding anything in particular, but they still were getting repeated calls about this werewolf in Walworth County, is what they're calling it. And so I remember just being like, oh man, we have our own story that's on the nightly news about a werewolf that's only 10 minutes away from my house.
Right.
So,
yeah, that would freak me out a little bit.
You'd be fat. It was like, I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. Because Wisconsin is a lovely place, especially in the summertime, but you just don't, it's just not the place of high adventure or paranormal weirdness that you think it is until you go in and discover that, we have a ton of interesting stories here. And where I went to high school, there was a hotel that was abandoned, never completed, that the owner, it was in the newspaper and everything, killed himself inside, and people were having haunted experiences inside this abandoned hotel. And so growing into it, I'm like, wow, there's these stories and these places all around us that's more than just fiction, where people are having actual experiences. And so in high school, we'd have these things called fright nights, and I'd drag my friends along to them. I'd be like, okay, guys, it's a Friday night and we're going to go break in, because we didn't break any glass or anything, but sneak into places that were abandoned.
Yeah. Or, that adds a little bit of thrill to it too.
Things that you do in high school, right? Yeah. That you're just like now you're like, oh man, I'm not a minor anymore. They'll give me trespassing. Back then you weren't that worried about it. The cops would just say, get the hell out of here, kind of thing. And so we would do that and try to, see if we could have weird experiences. And most of the time nothing happened, but then every once in a while something would happen and you wouldn't, you couldn't quite put your finger on it, but you experienced something that made you think there's something else out there. I don't quite get it yet. But there's something out there and I like to explore it. And so it's always been the kind of thing that I was into. And when we were in our band, Sunspot, we write songs and other people write really good love songs, Other people write really good, sad, depressing songs and things. And there's really talented musicians that write that. Not a lot of people write songs about werewolves.
No, it's like the
And
Werewolf in London. I think it's the only one I know about.
right,
Right?
right. And so we would take our inspiration from the weird, always, I mean, we had love songs and joke songs and things like that, but we would take our inspiration from things that we thought that other people write great love songs. Not everybody writes a breakup song about Scott Bakula. Okay, well, let's go in there and do it. And you find the things that you're inspired by that are a little different. And we go off touring, and we did regularly toured for years. And you'd come to these venues and hole in the walls and dive bars and things. And sometimes in big cities, sometimes in tiny cities. But either way, a lot of the venues had superstitions and legends and haunted stories. And we'd start talking to the bartenders, and they'd be like, yeah, well, don't worry. The ghost like turns the lights on and off at 1:15 every day. So you might see that, and don't worry about that. And you'd be like, give me a break whatsoever. And then you'd be 1:15, you're up at the bar ordering shots, the lights turn on and off.
Yeah, right.
And the bartender's standing right in front of you, and there's nobody else there. And you're like, how? Okay, you told me about this. They're like, yeah, it's just a ghost. Don't worry about it. And, I mean, whatever it is, it could be a power thing. It could be an electric company thing. There's a million things that it could be. But at the same time, you began to collect those stories from these places, and it would just make it fun. And
right.
And so it would give us something to talk about in addition to the music when we were playing at these clubs and stuff. And that eventually became where we were doing a podcast about like living a band life and going to different places and playing. But it ended up mostly being about the same thing. Oh, we're in the van. Oh, we went to the club. Oh, we had fun. We played some songs. We met this person and that person. They were nice, blah, blah, blah. And we got boring after a couple hundred episodes of the same kind of thing. So we thought, all right, well, what's something we're really interested in that can also provide us inspiration for music? And we thought, well, let's do a paranormal podcast because we're already talking about these things anyway, like the weird stuff. And then let's use that as inspiration to write a song for each episode. So we started 5 years ago. We started Halloween in 2014 was our first episode. And, 273 episodes later, we're still knocking them out. And now it's more about, I'm interviewing a lot of authors. We're talking to, sometimes it's paranormal reality TV people, like here's the ghost hunters or, things like that. And talking to them about their shows and then getting inspired by that. But either way, it's a field where there's always new, interesting stuff coming out. So there's always stuff to talk about. And then that means there's always new stuff to write music about. And it forces you, like if you just said, I'm going to get inspired by most of my, what happens to me in my life, I'm going to get inspired by it. Sometimes you get inspired, you're struck by lightning or whatever, when you're like, oh, that's a great idea. And then sometimes you just have to sit down with your guitar or the keyboard or whatever and force yourself to come up with an idea. And you're like, well, what's it going to be about this week? Well, lucid dreaming. Okay, let's go in there. And then you're trying to find any idea related to lucid dreaming or a little piece, or maybe somebody in an interview has a line that inspires then a line in the song. And so it's basically a way to find more inspiration, to talk about these things and also to give these things a forum where people can talk about it and don't have to feel like we're going to judge them. I mean, we're going to judge them a little bit, but not totally judge.
Yeah. Yeah, I could totally see how the paranormal and talking to people about that would give you an endless supply of inspiration and new ideas, especially mixing the ideas together and finding little connections between different stories and stuff like that.
And it does, and it helps. What's great is that sometimes you will be playing at like a paranormal convention, and we play at a lot of these different conventions across the Midwest. And when we do, there'll be people who are attending the convention where we wrote a song about them. Like there was a conversation, and then we could be like, we wrote a song about this dude, and he's like in the crowd or whatever. And it's a fun way where people had usually just maybe talk to that person or maybe watch that presentation by them. And so it almost, it then helps the paranormal community or whatever. Like here's a bunch of songs that aren't just about paranormal topics. They're about people who are in the paranormal field who we listen to on podcasts or see them on TV or, things like that. And it kind of, it becomes part of the scene a little bit, and that makes it fun.
Somebody in the chat said you guys are like the real life Scooby-Doo, chasing mysteries.
Mystery. Well,
or the mystery wagon. I'm sorry.
Well, in the van sometimes feels like the mystery machine or whatever when you're all in there. But you go to different locations and you get to meet people who have stories. And, a lot of the podcasts we do, it's over Skype or everything. But when we can get to places and do live stuff, investigations and everything like that, hell yeah, we're going to do them.
So what are some of the, I would say the most impressive things you've come across that impressed you that seemed like they were real deal paranormal things?
Well, I'd say there's been a couple of things. Like the biggest change I would think in my belief system, because I've always been fairly skeptical. It's like, I know that there's something out there, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah,
and
I'm the same way.
When people come in, they're like, well, I can tell you exactly what it is. That's when my eyes roll in the back of my head. Because I'm like, okay, yes, great. But I would say that the biggest thing that has changed for me is the idea of fairies. I know. Everybody's like, fairies, give me a break. Like Tinkerbell and stuff. Like, no, but like elementals or, creatures that are not human, that don't necessarily have like physical animal presences, but are also intelligent and can cause problems in people's lives. And what really changed me on that was I was interviewing a guy who wrote a book called Poltergeists over Scotland. And he had documented poltergeist stories from the Roman times up until modern era, and so he had these different picked out of different points in history, and how unique it was that we think of a poltergeist as like a teenage girl has too much psychic energy, and when she's mad at her mom, like a plate flies across the room and she's got that excess energy coming from her mind.
Yeah.
And that's definitely...
Holy shit. Sorry. Big old sonic boom just happened here. I was like,
okay, all right. Well, in Madison, we have F-35s, or I think we're going to get these F-35 airplanes that are coming, and I live maybe 2 miles from the airport. So
your story reached out and grabbed me right now. I was like, wow, what the?
We will get some. So if you hear sonic booms over me, they don't go that fast over us, but it's definitely right in the plane pathways. So that's definitely happens, that these things attach to teenage girls and seem to only happen when they're around. My sister is also really into this stuff, and we call it the family business, because we have like a haunted history tour company too. That's all through Milwaukee, awesome. Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so we have like 8 different cities with the haunted history tours in. And so my sister did some research in Milwaukee, and she, one of the stories is she's got this girl from the late 19th century, is like a poor, not a servant girl, but she's working in like a boarding house where most of the people work for this factory, industrial age Milwaukee. They're working in this factory. And so she's the girl working in the boarding house, probably doing the dishes and the laundry and cooking. 15 years old. And people start seeing weird things around her. They start getting poltergeist activity, strange sounds, footsteps, stuff flying off the walls, spoons fly. Everything you'd associate with the poltergeist is happening to this 15-year-old girl. And it gets to be such a big deal that the president of the factory comes down and says, what's going on? And then he has experiences right there in front of her, and they fire her from the boarding house. Well, they fire her from the boarding house. She has to go back to her parents' place, and then her dad ends up beating her and kicking her out of the house. And, she goes off to like jump off a bridge, and somebody sees her, and then she's going to jump off a bridge, and she jumps, but then she doesn't die, and it's just hits the water, and then ends up getting saved or whatever. But the thing is, if this girl was faking it, would she, would she do it to the point where she goes home, and if she wouldn't she fake it in the I was gonna say, are you under attack?
I don't know. I'm starting to wonder. Well, I live right next to Holloman Air Force Base. So.
Oh, okay. So they're flying around. It's just in situations like that where if it was in her head or whatever, if it was doing that, would she do something that would be so detrimental to her existence that would depress her to the point if she wants to jump off a bridge?
Yeah, right.
So it's those little things like, okay, it makes you rethink, well, maybe something was taunting her. Maybe something was doing it. And there's more examples of these, what we associate with poltergeist activity. Then all of a sudden, like in the 15th century, 16th century, there's reports that sound more like alien abductions than sound like poltergeists.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay.
There's a big community out there that thinks that extraterrestrials or ETs are more spiritual, demonic things or stuff like that too.
Oh yeah. And I mean, there's people who definitely are of the opinion that like aliens and demons are working together. And that sounds more like a role-playing game to me than anything else. But what I was trying to say was, like, these stories through time, an alien abduction in 1980 sounds like a fairy abduction in 1680, which is related to a poltergeist experience in 1780. And so you're starting to think, okay, obviously Tinkerbell, that's a fantasy. But this idea of, I hate to say extra dimensional beings because that makes it sound like there's a scientific, it's extra dimensional beings. But the idea of some kind of intelligence that we can't see screwing with us.
Yeah.
It turned me around to that, where I was like, well, give me a break. But then when you hear stories in Iceland about how they moved construction on something because the elves were causing trouble with the equipment. Or in Ireland, they move a road. Instead of going through this hill, they move the road around the hill instead of through it, because the dump trucks and the earth movers won't turn on when they're trying to do it. And you're like, well, why is that? And then you're thinking, okay, it may not be the brownies or the fairies or Santa's elves or whatever, but maybe there's some kind of intelligence that says, don't mess with this area, it's ours or something. And then we have to do it. So I don't have a unified theory on fairies or anything, but I would say, when you said that, the things that made me turn around the most, where I was in the beginning, where I was like, this is crap, I never want to talk about this. Now I'm willing to talk about it with people. And it was all because you'd have poltergeist experiences, which is something that I found plausible. And people were having poltergeist experiences associated with fairy experiences. And then the fairy experiences sounded a lot like alien abduction experiences, which for a long time I thought was plausible, and I still do.
Yeah.
And putting that all together, I was like, okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be Tinkerbell coming at you or Rainbow Bright or something.
Yeah.
It's some kind of intelligence out there. That
that really makes sense though, at whatever it is that's interacting with people. Because the sleep paralysis phenomenon, way back in the day, it was always witches or the devil or some kind of image of a cat. And nowadays you don't get that anymore. We're more of a technological civilization, and now it's almost always extraterrestrial vision. So it's almost like people put in, or I mean, not people, whatever the entity or thing is that's manipulating people or dealing with them, is putting in their head what they're most familiar with in their time period.
Well, that's right. And also something that I thought was interesting was, there was a book written by a guy named Joshua Cutchin. And Josh Cutchin, he's written several different, not necessarily occult books, but more studies of phenomena over time. And he wrote a book called The Brimstone Deceit, about the smells of the paranormal.
Wow.
And so brimstone, sulfur, the smell of sulfur that people associate, happens a lot of times in quote unquote demonic encounters. They encounter some kind of negative entity, and they smell rotten eggs, during it. It's like a disgusting smell to go along with the powerful feeling of evil or whatever they have.
Yeah.
But then he found in all these different reports, people would see a UFO and they would smell sulfur. People would see Bigfoot and they would smell sulfur. And so began to think like, okay, well, what is it about sulfur that all, people are having that smell while having different paranormal experiences? You could say that Bigfoot lives out in the forest or whatever, and is super hairy, so he's going to smell bad. But rotten eggs, like the flatulence part of it, like there's no volcano by there or anything. Like,
why right. You would think it would be like some kind of BO or animal smell versus like a sulfur smell.
Right. If you're looking up and you see a UFO, why so far away? Is it the UFO fuel or something you're smelling? So what is it about that particular smell that seems to either be the result of a paranormal experience or the precursor to a paranormal experience? And then to get back into the other intelligences fairies thing, I started thinking about what Terence McKenna used to call like the machinery elves.
Machinery elves.
So this idea, sometimes when people take hallucinogenics, they see things behind the curtain, let's say.
Well, yeah.
And so that idea of machinery elves is that there are creatures or intelligences who are manipulating things behind that we cannot see or notice. And they're not necessarily running things behind the scene, but kind of maybe patching things up, or they're among us, but we don't know that they are among us.
That really makes a lot of sense, considering like if you get into a scientific aspect of it, we only see like 3% of the spectrum or something like that, and we barely hear any of the sound. I mean, our ears just, so there's all kinds of things that we can't even detect just physically.
Well, and to go along with your when you were saying that people with a sleep paralysis, they thought it was a demon or an incubus or succubus in the 15th century. I mean, that's how like they think that the succubus or whatever was created out of how like monks would wake up in the middle of the night with nocturnal emissions or whatever, and they'd be like, well, I didn't have a sexual dream or whatever, it must have been the demon that was on me that caused that. So it's the devil, it's not me, man. But and then now when the people have sleep paralysis, I think it's going to be an alien. I mean, I had a sleep paralysis experience when I was reading the book Communion by Whitley Strieber. And so he talks about like he's like, it's not sleep paralysis, and I'll tell you why. And like that night, or maybe that week, I had totally had a sleep paralysis experience where I woke up and I saw all little faces surrounding me. And if I had not read the book, I mean, I'm sure that something in the book is what caused the dream to happen. Yeah. But when I woke up, and then like 10 seconds later, they were gone, but I couldn't move. I saw the little heads around me. I'm like, oh man, they're here. And then
you know what's bizarre about that is that I actually used to have sleep paralysis, and I never saw anything except for one time, and this was like early 90s, and it was like a person, and all I could describe is it was like black static, like the television.
Okay.
And then later, I found out that that's an actual phenomenon that other people have. And that actually scared me a little more than the actual experience, when I found out that other people had similar experiences and that it was a thing, because I didn't even really want to talk about it when it happened. And I put it off to stress and maybe too much, I was really heavy in sleep.
Sure.
But then later, I heard some of these other things that were even more wild than what I experienced. So it kind of gave me a little feeling that there was some credence to this phenomenon about something there that you're in between sleep and awake that you could perceive, and it kind of disappears when you actually break free from it.
Sure. Well, like the hypnagogic and the hypnopompic trances, you're going into sleep and out of sleep. That's when things look like your dreams get superimposed on reality.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I'm pretty sure it was just a hypnagogic trance because I had none of the alien abduction things, and I just read the book. And so it was just a scary thing, and I wasn't too freaked out about it. But I know that I interviewed this guy named Adam Gray, and him and his brother, they're Canadian filmmakers, and they developed an entire movie called The Nightmare after he had an old hag experience. He woke
Wow.
up in the middle of the night, felt it was paralyzed, saw like a old crazy looking woman on top of him. And he doesn't make it sound like she was humping him or was sexual or anything. He just said that she was on top of him, like holding down his chest, and he couldn't breathe. And it
Wow.
scared him so much that it affected him so much that he's like, we got to look into this. And then they flew around the world interviewing different people to make this movie called The Nightmare. And you can see it
Check that out.
on YouTube. I think The Nightmare's on YouTube. And also one of our episodes, we have an interview with the Gray brothers, who do, this kind of research. But so people, like what you said is that you have some kind of paranormal experience, and then it goes into something you can explain or something you kind of believe in yourself.
Yeah.
So to a lot of us today, it'd be like, well, aliens seem completely plausible, more than fairies do. It's like, okay, aliens seem plausible. At least to me, they've always seemed like it's a big universe. They're out there somewhere. Whether they're here or not is a different question. But there's got to be something out there in a gigantor universe. Just the idea that we're the only living creatures in the infinity of space, well, it's depressing, but also, it's less likely. So the thing is, and this takes me back to that smell, that paranormal smell that people were experiencing with all these different paranormal experiences, made me think, well, what if sulfur puts us into program mode? Or something like that. You think they talk about this with hallucinogenics. They talk about this with meditation. Magicians call it gnosis, that period where your mind is very susceptible or plastic.
Very placid, yeah.
And or hypnosis too. It's the same kind of thing. But so what if sulfur is what we smell when we're in program mode, and then when we come out of it, whatever we saw, we explain it in our heads as some kind of paranormal creature that we would believe in.
So like whatever your mind can rationalize it.
Right. The
Bigfoot. Weird thing for me is I actually thought it was a human being at first that was messing with me in my sleep. And I thought that they were like in my house or where I was at, and they were right in my face. But then, like when I broke free from the paralysis, as fast as I could go after and attack it, I could never touch it, and it just kind of dissolved right in front of me, So that's exactly what I did. I rationalized it to, I was half asleep, or maybe I was stressed out, even though I couldn't figure out why I would be stressed out. And I've had a lot of those sleep paralysis, but that was the only time I ever actually saw anything.
Well, and it's those specific type of things. Like a lot of us have woke up and like you can't move for a couple of seconds, but when they're accompanied by the hallucination, that's when it really is terrifying, because you feel like this other world, the world of your dreams, which could be nightmares a lot of times, has now invaded your regular world. So usually you wake up and like, whew, I can't, thank God that nightmare was nasty, I'm safe. Well, imagine when you wake up and you're not safe. Wake up, you can't move, and they're still there. So of course that's going to scare the crap out of people. And it just, when you're looking for, the paranormal and extraordinary experiences, it really feels to me that truly fantastic, like glimpses of the truly fantastic, are few and far between. But it's those times that make them so extraordinary. And it's those little synchronicities that happen, the things that like add up on top of each other, that all of a sudden you start to feel like, okay, maybe there's something more to this than I thought. Like, so, I mean, yes, absolutely. Coincidences can happen, or it could be somebody trying to tell you a message. Here's an example of something that happened to me. Like I said, we haunted history tours in different cities. And so a couple of years ago, I was talking to my wife, and we were like just at dinner or whatever. And I'm thinking, I need to find a warm weather city to have a tour in because Wisconsin and Minnesota, nobody wants to go outside in November. I don't want to go outside either.
Right.
And so we'd always been big fans of Puerto Rico, and we'd gone there a bunch of times and had friends, and it was like, oh man, they don't have anything in San Juan. It's such a great place. And wouldn't that be a fun idea? And she's like, yeah, that sounds interesting. Later on that night, as we're going to bed, I my wife says, hey, can you turn Coast to Coast AM? Now, my wife does not care about paranormal stuff whatsoever. Like, she thinks it's cute or whatever, but she's like, okay. But sometimes we used to listen to George Norrie or Coast to Coast AM. We went to bed. And that night, and we hadn't listened to it in like 6 months. That night she goes, hey, why don't you turn on Coast to Coast tonight? And we turn it on, and it's like a live report from Puerto Rico. Like, wow. That night. And she didn't even hear it because she already fell asleep by the time I turned it on. And so I'm like, crazy. Wait, I just brought up this idea today, and then you suggested we listen to something, and then it's like the live report of here's something paranormal going on there. And then all I can think is like, all right, well, I guess that answered my question.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that'll make you think there's way more than coincidence to things.
Right. And even though that might be just a coincidence, it's something that sets you off in the right direction. And I think you find out that as you go towards the things, not necessarily you're meant to do, but things that seem to add up, like more and more stuff adds up to see it works out for you. And so it's those little synchronicities, and you kind of put them together, and you start to maybe, people ask me about paranormal stuff. I would say the first thing to do is kind of open yourself to those synchronicities and just let it happen. And don't put a lot of, don't put too much thought into it or anything like that. Just start observing what happens around you and find the connections. And then doesn't make the world a mystical place or whatever, because that makes it sound like magical thinking, or, Tinkerbell is going to come out of the closet and grant your wishes. No, but it does provide some kind of, there's a web of things, and it's all connected on some level. And as you start to find more and more of those connections, I think you find yourself naturally pointing in a more positive direction in your life.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, it does. And with your podcast, I'm sure you've come across so many more stories. Did it kind of surprise you that it's a lot more common than you would have thought without talking or connecting with other people that have, similar stories and interests?
Well, a lot of times with people on the podcast in particular, I mean, they have like something they're selling, or there's a book or anything like that. So they're cool with, they're like, yeah, this is what happened to me, and I had a strange ghost experience, and then they'll jump into it. It's when people that you don't expect, like, come out with a ghost story. That's when you're like, wait a second. So this is really, in researching the haunted history tours, that's where I think I found most of these believable ghost stories. There was a club in Madison that my band used to play at all the time, and I'd known the owner for 20 years. It's a guy that we played in bands at the same time in the late 90s. Like, we used to play in his basement and parties and things. And then he eventually started running the punk dive bar in Madison. And so when I was working on this Madison tour, I would go around to the different bars that were downtown by the Capitol. And because you were looking for a route that had some history with the Capitol, and then you had maybe a place people could duck in for a beer or a shot or something like that on the tour. And so I walk in there. I'm like, dude, I know this is going to sound weird. But is your club haunted? And he just looks at me like, what? And I'm like, oh no, okay. He's like, are you serious? And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, I want to do a haunted history tour of the downtown, and I would love to have this place be a stop. And he's like, well, yeah. And then straight up, he's like, the first story he tells me, he goes, a couple months ago, I was in the basement. His office was in the basement of the club, like by the dressing room area. There's like a dressing room, green room, and then you go upstairs to the stage, but his office was by the dressing room. And he goes, it was late at night. I fell asleep at my desk, like when I had to do some numbers or paperwork, and it was super boring, so I fell asleep. I wake up and it's after bar time, and he hears, his door was closed, and he hears out in the dressing room, "Do you think he can hear us? Do you think he can hear us?" And he thinks that it's a staff, that the staff is like staying out late and they want to get home. They don't know if they should like say goodbye or wake him up. And he just wants to, he gets up, he opens the door, and he's like, "Hey guys, it's okay." It's
Nobody
all
there.
black. There's nobody there. And he's like,
Wow.
"Wait a second." And so then he goes upstairs. The bar is empty. Everybody closed up for the night. Comes back down to his room to get the rest of the stuff in his office. When he closes the door and then goes back to get the stuff, they ask, he can start hearing him again. "Oh, he heard us." And he hears this whispering outside the door. And he's like, "Hold on." And then he goes out there, turns on the lights. There's not a single person in the place. And
That would freak me out.
and he's like, "Yeah, that was the first time I heard something." And the thing is, he goes, "When I started investigating the history of the building, I discovered that it used to be a funeral home, and they'd keep the bodies, like there was the gallery area upstairs, the funeral parlor area, which is now a realty place. And then there was wherever they would keep the bodies. Well, they would keep the bodies where the dressing room was." And so, he tells me that story. And then the other people that start working there start talking about, yeah. And, this is what happened to me. I was in the bathroom and heard like a lightning crash. And I thought that, and then the lights flashed in the bathroom. I thought it was a band setting up. Once I came out of the bathroom, I went to go check, and the sound guy wasn't even there yet. The only person was there was the bartender in the other room. And one time they had they'd already locked up for the night. And then from out of the basement, somebody came up, and he's like, "I'm looking for Jackson." And they said, "What? Where did you?" First, they said, like, "Where did you come from?" Because he came up the stairs and then came into the bar area while they were all closing up and counting out the money. He said, "I'm looking for Jackson." And they're like, "That's okay. There's no Jackson here. You got to go. It's after bar time. You're not a customer. You're not an employee, whatever. You got to get out of here." He's like, and all he kept on repeating was, "I'm looking for Jackson. I'm looking for Jackson." And then they just opened for the door. Nobody touched him, but he comes in like from the downstairs, walks through, asks questions a bunch of times, walks out the door, turns the corner, and then they didn't see him again. So like where'd that guy come from? Little things like that. And then you have synchronicities that happened where one time I'm leading a tour there and we're in the basement. And I'm about to tell the story about how there used to be bodies in the basement and what he heard in the dressing room or what he heard in his office. And it's funny, this is Halloween night, like maybe 2010. This lady comes walking down the stairs and she's like, "Are you telling ghost stories?" And I'm like, "Oh, what I need right now is some drunk chick interrupting my story." And I'm like, "Yes, we are telling ghost stories." She goes, "Good." And then she goes in. She was the one who painted this mural in the dressing room. And so she stayed overnight there for 2 nights when they first were putting the club together. And she goes, "Well, let me tell you something about the ghosts down here. When I was painting this mural, they wouldn't leave me alone."
Wow.
And then and I'm like, well, this ended up being perfect that everybody at the tour thought I'd set it up. They're like, "Oh, did you tell her to come down at this time?" I'm like, "Guys, I didn't know this chick existed." Right. But when you have that and you have people who just, it's not part of their nature to be interested in weird stuff. And they tell you a little bit skeptically, or they're like, it's always funny when you meet an owner of a place, and the owners are usually of 2 different minds. The one mind is, well, ghost stories are going to be good for business because they know that haunted tourism is a thing. And then the ghosts are coming out of the walls. Then all of a sudden every Chicago gangster stayed at their Wisconsin, inn at some point. Or they're like, "Well, I don't believe in ghosts, but yeah, a Civil War soldier walked across the hallway." And
I don't believe in it, but I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so those are the stories that I find to be sometimes the most compelling, because it's not somebody who necessarily wants to, they're not looking for attention for it. Not that there's anything wrong if you got a story and a message, and that's all, I mean, that's really can be really interesting. But it's the people who are just like, they're telling you in the way of, well, look, don't say it was me, but this is what happened to me. And a lot of times those stories I find to be the most compelling, because it's not somebody who's, they don't care about the extra business in their bar. They don't, you know, what they had was something that happened to them despite them not believing in it. So it doesn't matter if you believe in ghosts, if they believe in you.
Right. You think some of those people that are kind of more serious and then they still tell that are kind of expecting you to give them an explanation and of why, you know, it's not something supernatural?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's always, because I debunk a lot of stuff. Not that I say debunk is it, but if something comes in and I can see a more terrestrial explanation, I'm just like, well, yeah, it's just that. I mean, before we go off and say that it's your grandmother coming back from the dead, it also might just be, you know, somebody watching Matlock next door.
You're right.
Right? There's a, you know,
Murder She Wrote.
right. There's a million different things that it can be before it's paranormal. And we got to get to those million different things before we get to the paranormal one. And then once we get to the paranormal one, that's when it really becomes interesting. When you say like, well, it can't be this and it can't be that. I mean, and I haven't had a million experiences, but my most, my most, I'd say not effective, but the one that affected me the most happened when I was in high school, and we were going on one of these fright nights, and we were walking down a hunting trail near where one of my friends lived. And he said there was this evil tree. Like it was like, he's like, there's like a handprint burned into the tree, and it's super,
Wow.
super evil. And I'm like, what? It was a nice summer night. I'm like, well, let's go and check it out anyway. And so we're walking down this pathway, and it's a rural area, but there's a train, like railroad tracks and kind of thing, but a real rural area. And we're walking through this path, and it's a hunting area, so it's got some signs. It's a full moon, or at least maybe not a full moon, but close, where it was super bright. And we didn't even need flashlights. We were walking around outside at like 9 o'clock at night. Maybe a little later than 9 o'clock, probably closer to 10, because it was dark, like real dark. And so as we're walking, we see the tree, and it's stupid. I'm like, okay, this is dumb. And so I make fun of the guy a little bit, because it's him and his girlfriend and another guy and his girlfriend, and then just me. So I'm like the fifth wheel on this operation.
Yeah. So you got to debunk it, because, you know, they're trying to
scare the girl
factor going and snuggle.
Absolutely. No. That's like taking a girl on a roller coaster or whatever. Like you do that because the adrenaline gets all up, and then all of a sudden you guys are closer than ever. So he like, okay. And then it kind of joke around and like, that's, you know, funny, and thinking that he is doing that specifically to try to get the girls a little scared. And so we keep going down the pathway a little bit. I'm walking with the girls, and the two guys are walking maybe 20 yards back. And they're talking and joking about something, and I'm joking with these girls. And so we walk, and there's a sign there that has the hunting rules and regulations. And this is in July or whatever. So there's no hunting in July in Wisconsin. That's not until November.
Right.
But it's got the rules. And I see the sign, and I can read the sign except for the black shadow against it. It's a humanoid shadow. And if it was a person, there was enough light where I'd see a nose, see a chin, where the hair would be, where the eyes would be. This was looking at something that did not reflect light. And I see this, and I'm looking at a shadow figure, and I'm like, holy crap. And I blink a couple of times, and I think, you know what? I must be seeing the shadow of a tree or something. Or my eyes are playing tricks on me. I turn and look, and the girls on either side of me are speechless. They see it too. And I'm like, and immediately both of them start weeping. like not just like kind of scared kind of thing, but like a feeling of like they had like a feeling of dread and fear and started crying.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh man, like what's going on? So they run back to their boyfriends, and I'm still looking, and it's not like moving or anything. It's just a shadow there, but it feels like a presence. It doesn't just look like a shadow of a tree or a person even. It looks like something that doesn't reflect light. And I turn back and look and see the girls running away. And then when I turn back to see it, I can read the whole sign. There's nothing there.
Yeah, that's pretty spooky, man. So it's like a shadow man, but you didn't actually see it, and then when you look away, then it's not there anymore.
Well, what got me, like, first of all, because the thing is, a lot of people talk about and seeing the shadow figures and the shadow men in the corner of their eyes. Now, I see that all the time too. I'm like, well, yeah, you see stuff in the corner of your eye or whatever, and this was like a full on figure. And the reason it gets me is that we all saw it.
Yeah.
Like all three of us saw it. All three of us reacted to it. I didn't have the emotional reaction that they did, but I'm also not quite as sensitive as a 16-year-old girl.
Well, I'm sure that the two girls also seeing it and reinforcing what you're seeing kind of made it a little more real as well, because you're not the only one that's seeing it.
Right. Well, that's what got me. I was like, oh, because if it was just me, I'd be like, well, my mom's got bad eyes or whatever. Maybe it's just, or my rods and cones were messed up, or a hallucination. I mean, we weren't drinking or smoking pot or anything. I mean, this is like, we were playing like a tabletop game before we went out there. Like it was about as wholesome as possible, at least for me, but I wasn't with the girls like the other guys were. So I was really like, we weren't on anything and I just was like, holy crap. And so the fact that like my first quote unquote paranormal experience was one that was reinforced with other people, was like, okay, well, there's something there. And that's when we'd keep on going on our fright nights or whatever. We would keep on trying to chase that.
Yeah, right. And that's even a little better than any kind of experience you have by yourself, because, when it's only you that sees something, it's just a story. But when you have other people that see it, it's a little more real whenever you convey it to someone else that, you're not the only one that saw it. There's witnesses. There's other people that might have, saw whatever they saw. Like I've seen things before that, you might call a UFO, but there's never anyone around other than me. So it's like, there's no use in even talking about it because it's only me that saw it.
Right. And, this kind of leads into a different story. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I haven't really had a chance to talk about this much on our podcast yet. And it's something that I just kind of realized in the past year. One thing we've talked about our podcast, I described earlier the werewolf we had when I was in high school, the Beast of Bray Road. And they still make documentaries about the Beast of Bray Road. The woman who wrote the book on it, Linda Godfrey, we have her regularly on our podcast. And, my sister goes on hikes with her where they go out looking for cryptids and stuff. But right around the early 90s, when they had seen the Beast of Bray Road, is a documentary called The Bray Road Beast, done by this guy named Seth Breedlove, who's got a series of videos called Small Town Monsters. And they go into some different avenues that aren't as explored as some other documentaries are, the ones that you might see on like the Travel Channel or History Channel. And so he's talking to the Walworth County Animal Control Officer. And the guy from Walworth County is talking about how not too long after the sightings, they found like dead carcasses of animals, not just dead, but like mutilated kind of thing. And to him, it looked like some kind of animal sacrifice, because he said these were way too many animals, the way the bodies were stacked. And so they explored that idea that the Beast of Bray Road wasn't a cryptid. it wasn't just some kind of dog that walks on two legs, because a lot of people have reported seeing a bipedal canine where it's like the dog can get up, walk on two legs for a while, scares crap out of people because you're not used to seeing a dog walk on two legs, especially if it's a big dog, but it happens. And dogs can be trained in that. So, but they go into this idea that maybe the Bray Road Beast wasn't a cryptid or like a mysterious animal or a wolf or something. Maybe it was like a creature called forth by these satanic rituals or whatever. Now, all right. When I first heard that, I'm like, oh, that's whatever. Cause like I grew up in the area and I'm like, who is worshiping Satan?
Right.
But okay. Now, then I go back and I start remembering. Remember I said there was a hotel near where I grew up that was abandoned. And it was completely built and the developer ran out of funds. And so, they had a golf course on the site, and after the developer killed himself, the golf course opened, but the hotel was just still up. Like it just was still up and abandoned. And the JCs would run a little haunted house there on Halloween time, but otherwise there was nobody else in there for the entire year. And so in the middle of winter, this is about 1994, we knew a guy who worked at the golf course, and he's like, "Oh, I can get you into the hotel." And I'm like, "Well, we heard the hotel is haunted." And I'm like, "I'm going in the hotel."
Awesome.
And it was awesome. You go in there, it was like looking at, because it was snowy. And of course it's snowy in January in Wisconsin, but the snow was inside the rooms, like because some of the windows were broken, like you'd go into this ballroom that was full of snow and it looked like you were, walking into life after people. That kind of show where it's like, what is the world going to look like if we just all disappeared one day and in 20 years, nature takes back the city? That's how I felt walking around the building. And
that's spooky by itself.
Right. It was super weird. And it was cool. Like you'd see, this is like the coax cables were hanging out of the wall where they would hook up the TVs in the late 60s when they were working on it. Yeah. There were beds, there were chairs, like there was furniture in this place. They just didn't know what to do with it because it was never finished. And so we're walking through and it's pretty interesting. And, if there's no lights or anything, there's lights on in the kitchen. There was one place that still had electricity. We were able to turn lights on. And then I found the old brochures that said like, you can, the greatest resort in Wisconsin or whatever that's going to open and stuff. And they have these brochures for a place that never opened. And so of course I stole one, but there was a million of them. And the place eventually burned down in 2012, I think. So it no longer is standing because, I'm not sure if it was arson or something, but somebody eventually burned it down. But we're walking through and we come into this room and there was no snow on the ground, but somebody had drawn a pentagram into the floor and there was chicken guts like all around. So they performed an animal sacrifice here. And at the time I'm thinking like, this is like somebody had listened to too many Ozzy albums or something. Like this is just ridiculous. Or this is what they thought that some occult ritual would be. And this is just stupid. So I'm thinking this is dumb because it's not a real paranormal experience, right? It's not, I'm seeing what humans did, not like any ghost business. But then we were kind of creeped out in the room because obviously you come into a room, it's got a pentagram on the floor and a bunch of chicken guts around it. Like, because then we heard movement, like there was movement in the hallway behind us. So then turn out the flashlights in the ritual room or whatever and just duck. And so it sounded like somebody else was walking. So I'm like, oh my God, they conducted a ritual. They're still here.
Yeah, right.
And then we just quiet until the movement stopped and kept on going. We explored the hotel. It was really interesting, but it wasn't anything paranormal, but we did see that. All right. Cue to like 6 months later. There's an abandoned farmhouse that's, now it's like a Walmart and things like that. But at the time, it was an abandoned farmhouse in this rural area.
Leave it to Walmart to ruin small town. God, no, I'm just joking. Go ahead.
It was fun. So there's this abandoned farmhouse. And I was talking, my sister doesn't remember this. It's funny because I think she might have just made this up to scare me when I was a kid. But when we would drive by the Savannah farmhouse, she's like, oh yeah, they call that the gates of hell. And you do the Ouija board there and you see weird stuff.
Wow.
And she might have told me that when I was like 7 or something. So this is 10 years later. And I passed by this on the school bus a million times. And I always wanted to go to the gates of hell. And I get a group of people and we'll go to the Savannah farmhouse. And we go there and like part of it's burnt down. Part of the walls are, like ripped down but it's still a structure. And we get in there. We put down the Ouija board. There's about 10 of us. We had a big group, half guys, half girls. And I sit down with the Ouija board with this girl. And my buddy walks up. He's like, here, use this as an antenna. And he throws a bone down on the Ouija board.
Oh, great.
And I'm like, what? I'm like, where did you get that? He's like, they're in the walls. And we look in the walls and there's a ton of different animal bones in the wall, like cow bones, chick. There's a ton of different animal bones in the walls of this building.
Freaky.
And, so we didn't see anything paranormal or like have any experiences that night. And then I just thought that was another weird thing of kids acting stupid. Of just, like bored farm kids. They're like, well, we got a dead cow. Let's take the bones and put them in the walls of an abandoned. Okay, I don't know why they would have done that.
Yeah, but that's bizarre, man. Yeah.
So but the thing is, when I was watching that documentary, it made me realize, hold on a second. If people are talking about these rituals happening in Walworth County in the early 1990s, and here I am 10 miles away from where people saw the werewolf of Walworth County and the Beast of Bray Road. Here I am not that far away. And I've got 2 cases of where I just thought it was high school kids having a dumb prank or something, but actually doing some kind of ritual involving animal sacrifice. Like, oh no, I was at the location of 2 other animal sacrifice places and the same time frame of all this stuff happened. Okay, maybe there was something to, like all of a sudden you're like, I'm like, what are you talking about? That stuff doesn't happen. But I'm like, no, I was at 2 places where the animal sacrifices I'd witnessed, not necessarily witnessed, but I'd witnessed the aftermath.
Yeah.
And then you got the animal control officer talking about something happening. And here I am my entire life thinking the satanic panic is some huge joke. And I'm like, well, I still think that Dungeons and Dragons isn't the force of evil. But what I do think is that maybe some people were doing some kind of rituals in southeastern Wisconsin in the late 80s and early 90s. And I don't know why, but was the Beast of Bray Road then manifested by somebody trying to bring over some kind of power from the other side? I'm not sure, but I tell you, in the past, I would have thought that was the dumbest idea in the world unless I'd seen that stuff for myself. And it was stuff I hadn't even connected to each other until last year when I watched the documentary. And I'm like, animal sacrifices? Who does that? Wait. So that was my own kind of thing. Like people say, I don't believe in ghosts. But.
You know what's so weird about that is I'm like a newsie. So I read just tons of articles. And there's a growing number of articles talking about how in the United States, and they don't tell you really how long they've been doing it because it's legal. There's actual human animal chimeras in labs all across the US. Now, they don't tell you any specifics, like how much percentage of a human it is. Like the only articles you really get to dive into are like, animals like pigs or whatever that are growing human organs. But the whole concept of that's like thousands of years old, about conjuring things into reality, not even on the technological end, but just, like sigils and different things where they're supposed to be calling demons or devil or, so I think that could be totally possible.
Well, it's the other idea of the tulpa too, where I know that Alexander David Neal, like what she thought of as the tulpa, like she introduced this idea. This is a French woman. She's an explorer in the 1920s and 30s. She goes to Tibet. She dresses like a man and stuff like that because she couldn't get in as a woman. And she's really Alexander is a fascinating explorer, but she's hanging out with these monks and she sees that these monks that meditate and think, they tell her about these thought forms they create that do chores for them.
Wow.
So so they have more time to meditate. They say that they can create thought forms that will do household work and stuff. But you have to beware, because sometimes that they get a mind of their own. And immediately I start thinking of the old Jewish stories of the golem.
Yeah, right.
Where, that you make the golem out of clay or something and you give it life and it's supposed to do a job for you, but then that turns out poorly. I mean, that's the golem, that's Frankenstein's monster, and then there's the tulpa. And so she herself says that she's meditating with these monks and trying to create a thought form. And she says she creates like a shadow type figure of a thought form herself. She said it didn't like reach full status where it could do stuff, but she said she saw it. And, after her meditation, a creature that she created with her mind. Wow. And so when you talk about these calling forth things, it makes me think of, the tulpa. And, Nick Redfern, he was a paranormal author. He talks about that in his book about the Slender Man. And
I was just about to ask you that.
And he interviews me and my sister in the Slender Man book, because a couple interesting things. So number one, I have a ghost tour in Waukesha, Waukesha, Wisconsin, where the girls were stabbed. Where the Slender Man stabbing happened is a couple of miles away from where I saw the shadow figure. But people have had reports now of seeing the Slender Man, a completely fictional figure, but I mean, when you talk about a blood sacrifice, they stabbed someone to this fictional figure, and now people have seen.
Yeah, it's like the energy manifested from people believing in it.
Well, interesting enough, so my sister, what she talks about in the book is that she's listening to Dave Schrader was doing Coast to Coast AM. Dave Schrader's in the Holzer Files now, big bald guy, funny, but he used to do Coast to Coast Saturday night. And so he was doing a Coast to Coast AM about the Slender Man the night before the stabbing happened. So now you have, so Coast to Coast gets what, maybe 1 million people? I mean, 2 million people probably on the big nights, maybe a Saturday night, 500,000 to 1 million people listening. But you have 1 million people thinking of this creature, this idea for the first time.
And that's a lot of energy directed at one idea there.
I know. And I know this is all completely unscientific, but the idea though, that concept is introduced to 1 million people for the first time. They're all thinking about it. The next day, the girls obviously have mental issues and stuff. And she stabs her friend, the poor girl, and the poor girl finally came back. Now I think she's 17. She did her first interview. And she has some semblance of a normal life. So the victim made it out, thank God. But it all kind of adds up to where if you want to put something into existence or think something into existence, you have the combination of a massive amount of people's thoughts and focus, and then you have some kind of sacrifice that goes into that is devoted to that creation. And then not too long after, you have people seeing something in real life. Now, we were talking about magic and ritual, there's a great book by a guy named Dean Radin, Dr. Dean Radin, called Real Magic. And in it, I mean, he talks about the synchronicities he's seen in his own life. And he's like one of the few guys with a PhD who does really great paranormal experiments. But he's doing these experiments on magic. And he's saying that for some reason, magic works to a small extent, like create like putting your energy and doing these rituals creates more synchronicities or luck or in people's lives. And that, they proved some of these things in some experiments. And I mean, nobody was able to make something levitate or whatever, but they were able to make, predict random numbers and little things like that. And he goes, it seems like it doesn't even matter if you believe in it. What matters is that you perform the ritual, and the ceremony is what makes it work. It's going through these motions where we would think where the belief is what makes it work. It's the ceremony of like a recipe. Like I turn to the sun and then I read this book. I read this saying 4 times and then throw some salt over my shoulder. It's those when people go through the parts of a ritual, it seems to have a bigger effect on whatever kind of magical effect they're trying to make. And so it's funny because all these things we talk about on the podcast, from magic to tulpas to people, satanic abuse or whatever, all those little things come together and you start to see connections between the stories. Just like we were talking about, here's the rituals in Walworth County, and there are the animal sacrifices, and there are people seeing a werewolf. And then here's people thinking about the Slender Man. Here's a ritual and a sacrifice done to the Slender Man. And then people start seeing the Slender Man. And so it kind of starts coming together in, well, could it all be a coincidence? Could be people's imaginations, yeah, sure. But it also, all the ingredients are there together for some kind of thing that we can't explain. And I wish you conjure like things like that are fun instead of conjuring.
I want that leprechaun to give me some gold, man.
Right. Let's conjure that guy.
What do you think about, though, that there is kind of some scientific backing to this idea? Like if you read about in physics, how they do the double slot study, where the photons are doing their thing, nobody's paying attention to them and they just do their thing. But then now that someone's observing it, they change their behavior. So that's like a literal manifestation of your thoughts changing matter in real life. So, that's definitely. And another thing with the sleep paralysis, you kind of made me think that linking that to that could be a projection of something like in your subconscious that you're forming, that's becoming a real thing because you're thinking about it maybe before you woke up or whatever. Like you were saying, how the nightmare kind of overlaps with reality.
Well, that idea, originally, think about Freddy Krueger. And Wes Craven, he even uses that idea in A New Nightmare. That so many people saw Freddy Krueger in the movies and everything that eventually he was able to come over into reality from fiction, because he became the object of so many people's thoughts. Now, what inspired Wes Craven to make A Nightmare on Elm Street was what was happening to the Hmong people from Southeast Asia. So the Hmong were a group of Vietnamese who were on the U.S. side.
Yeah.
So like and so after the Vietnam War, we evacuated as many of them as possible and brought them over to the United States. And so there are different areas of the U.S., usually around the bases where they brought the Hmong from Vietnam, and usually the big cities around the bases will then have a significant Hmong population.
Yeah.
In Southern California, the Hmong population in the 1970s, what was happening was that these guys were like young, healthy men. Their hearts were stopping in the middle of the night, and there were several of them that just died.
Wow.
And they talk about this in the Nightmare movie that the Gray brothers did. And the Hmong, they thought it was because, they need to do these rituals, these religious rituals regularly in order to protect them from evil spirits. And there's a certain spirit, the Da Cho, that they thought was coming to kill these young men in the middle of the night. And because they were in a new country, they didn't have the right places. They didn't, they weren't on like homes where they could do the correct rituals and everything, this correct ceremonies. Now people were vulnerable to the evil spirits that came with them from Southeast Asia.
So they totally believe they were unprotected because of being in a new place.
Yeah. And these guys believed it, and then that started to go through the community too. So then more people when people actually die in their sleep, that's your proof is right there. Now, is it necessarily something paranormal? No. There's a lot of reasons. I mean, first of all, just getting used to the American diet can kill people, but but there's a lot of reasons it could be, but at the same time, it reinforces the belief in other people. It reinforces the belief in a tightly knit community who's even more tightly knit because they're strangers in a new place. Already it's hard. Already you got to leave your homeland. It's going to be a hard life. And so now you're vulnerable to these evil spirits that came after you that always want to hurt you, but now they can because you can't protect yourself ritualistically. And so Wes Craven, when he read that, was an article about the New York Times in the early 70s. Wes Craven read that and then it was like, well, what if you die in your sleep, you die in real life? And what if somebody would come after you in your dreams? And that's where he came up with the idea for Freddy Krueger from that particular story. But, I think almost a story about the Vietnamese, the Hmong people from Vietnam coming to the United States, I almost think that might be a better movie. Like I'd want to see that, like their story, like you could even fictionalize it and make it like fighting off the evil spirits or whatever. But it's, I'm like, that's a story in itself where I think the inspiration might be more interesting than the fictionalization that comes after it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
No, I hear you. When it comes to this idea that, okay, well, we have these powerful thoughts. And when you have these powerful thoughts accompanied by a lot of energy, can it cross over? I mean, people see Santa Claus. The drummer in my band saw the Tooth Fairy.
Wow.
Like she has a memory and she'll tell you this. I mean, we talked about this in the podcast. It's one of my favorite stories because I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, yeah, the wings and everything. And her parents did not dress up like the Tooth Fairy or anything, but she has this memory. And sure, it sounds like something that could be a dream kind of thing that a little girl would think. But at the same time, you've got millions of kids who put is the Tooth Fairy real? Well, as long as you put your tooth under the pillow and a quarter shows up, well, maybe $1 now. I don't know how inflation goes, but as long as money shows up out of that pillow and you wake up, the Tooth Fairy is real to you. And people see, like I said, people see Santa Claus. Like there's a whole bunch of reports of this character, like basically, our idea of the character, how he looks, comes from Coca-Cola advertisements, mid 20th century Coca-Cola advertisements. And that's who people have reports of seeing. So tulpas, thought forms, or just seeing things that should not be there according to our, the materialist narrative. When you see it, it just blows your mind to touch.
That's kind of weird because they keep putting that same theme in different movies. My kid's like 14 now, but we used to watch a lot of the kids' films.
Sure.
And that's a common theme is these, Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and all of these people disappearing because nobody believes in them no more. And then they got to get juiced up with the Christmas spirit where they got some power again. And it's not just that, a lot of science fiction, like the show Supernatural, where they talked about the old world's gods. They didn't have no power anymore because nobody prayed to them or worshiped them or did sacrifices for them anymore. So that's a common theme in Hollywood, that they're trying to portray that back to you, that the same concept there, that the more belief in something, the more real it is.
Yeah. And that's the entire, that's basically the entire plot of American Gods by Neil Gaiman, is that, the old gods, the European gods, are weak because people don't believe them anymore. And now we have the new gods of media and TV and stuff like that. And, and that's the idea that the old gods come to the US to take on the new gods because they want their belief back. They want their power back. And that is an interesting idea. And it's funny when it seems to manifest itself in reality. Like, obviously it's not as Hollywoodized or whatever, or it's not as obvious as a movie would make it. But the power of thinking of something, it absolutely, and that's when you talk about magic. It's about orienting yourself in a certain direction, and things don't manifest themselves out of nowhere. But and you can even say that self-help books and Tony Robbins and all that kind of thing are just there. It's magic on a level that's more believable, where in the past they might believe in, fairies and household spirits and things. Now people have a belief in the power of the law of attraction. Oprah talked about the law of, she had a whole thing on the law of attraction. She sold that secret book and everything. And just the idea is that you're orienting yourself in the right direction. Well, what's the difference between that and magic?
Yeah, well, like for an example, you had Diamond Doubleday, or I think that's his name, the guy that invented baseball. And when you look into the way that the whole stadium's set up, it's all about it's this big sigil that takes the crowd's power and puts it kind of on the pitcher's mound, and they put a lot of what is it, magical numbers like 369, and everything's divided by 9 in the game, like there's 9 ways to get home, and the stitching on the baseball and the number of players and all of that stuff. So a lot of the elite really believe in these concepts about bringing in energy and putting it into a place of their choosing. Sure. Just kind of like you were saying about that. I haven't watched that show. I should watch it though, about there's the New World Gods, kind of the media and sports and all of these other things that suck out your energy. Oh, even television. I mean, think about how fake reality all day. You watch a movie and then you feel for the characters. How you have a lot of you get emotion from the music and the colors and the scenarios, and you identify with these fake people. And then at the end of the day, you're kind of zapped out of all of those endorphins and stuff. Because you put it into the TV, and then you go back out into reality, and then there's, you don't have none left for real people.
Right. And hey, think about how people felt at the end of Game of Thrones. You know what I mean? Like, it's a TV show. Either you liked it, it's one thing to be like, yeah, I thought the ending was good, or I didn't find it believable, or it didn't seem true to the character, blah, blah, blah.
But I wanted my money back at the end.
But people felt like, oh my God, like it didn't, they felt like they knew these people, these fictional characters, right? And so it was so upsetting when it didn't end in a satisfactory way for them. I mean, hey, I'm comparing it to Lost. Like, I remember, that's how I felt at the end of, man. That's how I felt at the end of Lost. Like, I put my hand.
That was an epic burn on Lost.
I put my hand really through the television. No, so these guys, I like that I don't like the idea, but I think that what you're saying though is true. When you put so much energy into fiction, there's other humans that could use some of that energy. Right. And instead we're like, oh man, I'm too tired because I got really upset by this Stephen King book. We can talk about your problems tomorrow.
I'm guilty of it too, man. When I zorb out into something like I just started this German series called Dark.
Oh, sure. I heard good things about it.
Yeah, it's pretty trippy. And it's like the first thing, because I get irritated at television because they do so many cliches that you're used to, where you know what's about to happen. Like, as soon as they say a phrase or they show a certain thing, like, the classic thing, if they show a gun, it'll come back in the story later.
Right.
It's like that. But it's rare that I actually get a television program or something that feels like a new idea that, like I don't know what's coming.
Foreign films are especially good for that because we're not familiar with the actors. Yeah. Especially in American films, like, we know that if Brad Pitt's going to be there, they're not going to kill off the hero halfway through. Right. That's what made the first season of Game of Thrones so shocking. When the main character gets killed, spoiler alert, it's about 8 years old now though. And the book's been out for like 25.
No, Jon Snow. I know all the girls got mad about that, but they brought him back.
Yeah, but the thing is, when you kill off a main character like right in the beginning, or I remember there's a movie called Executive Decision with Kurt Russell, and then Steven Seagal plays this guy. I'm like, oh, Steven Seagal's in it. I didn't even know Steven Seagal gets killed off in the first half an hour, and you're like, oh, like it's completely not what you expect. And so when people subvert your expectations a little bit, like foreign films can do, because you don't know who, you might be familiar with the actors, but we have a different relationship with them, at least story-wise than we do with American actors who we recognize, and we kind of know the conventions of they're going to be on, that it's going to be this much screen time for the main actor. They're not going to kill. They're going to wait until the season finale to have a major death and all those kind of things. And with a foreign series, all bets are off.
You know what's really weird is, and you guys should try this at home. You watch a foreign film, if you watch it with the English voiceovers, to me it completely ruins it for me, because it's so out of sync. But if you watch it in the original language, I know it's kind of irritating for some people to read it if they don't, but it's so much more real, or at least it feels real, because you're getting the actual vibe off of the people portraying the characters. And it's a really weird thing how you get manipulated by soundtracks and things like that, because you can take a movie that's really sad, a sad scene, and then put some happy music on it. And it'll totally feel like a whole different thing when you're watching it. Like your mind perceives it totally different.
Well, and that goes right back into when you talk about the susceptibility, the power of the mind, sensitivity, like little things, one change can then change the entire meaning of something.
Yeah.
And so, when we go back to this idea of the fairies or machinery elves or somebody coming in, and paranormal experiences being something where some kind of intelligence reprograms us a little bit, it goes into like when our phone is in reset mode or something like that, like your head's like that. And, that's where you can find people when, if they take MDMA or a lot of people have had psilocybin, they've had experiences where their mindset changes forever. Like they see something. Yeah. And
I know that.
Right. Sure. And like people will have experiences where all of a sudden it completely changes how they think about reality. And so if we can do that to ourselves with psychedelics, then what if something else is doing that to us? And it's just it's a subtle change. And then we remember it as, oh, I saw a weird light in the sky. Or sometimes what makes me think about this is that, so my sister is also very skeptical about ghosts, even though she's seen a couple of weird things. But when the reason you're skeptical is not because you want to disprove them, but because you want to get to the situations, you want to get to the experiences where they actually might be right. So you want to disprove. That's right. You want to disprove.
I'm skeptical because I want to prove the real thing when it's real.
You want to nail because all of a sudden when you go everything and you're like, that's it. That's the golden goose, is when you find a story where every kind of normal explanation is, that's the Sherlock Holmes thing. Once you've deducted everything besides the impossible must be true. And I know that's a bad paraphrase, but you guys have heard that quote before. Yeah. So you know what I mean? But she's talking about, she was at a place where we were doing like a live show and podcast, and she was also doing a presentation. And she was very skeptical that this place was haunted at all, because it seems like they got ghosts coming out of the woodwork, like ghosts sneaking out of the closets. The drinks are named after ghosts. They can do the ghost Jaeger bomb kind of thing, place. It's one of those places.
They touristed it up.
Yeah. And it's fun or whatever, but it's not necessarily a place for a quality paranormal experience. But she herself, she was getting up and walking across the room, and she said she saw a glowing orb come right to her face and then zip off. And the way it moved, like it wasn't just in her, she's like, no, it was three-dimensional. It was like looking at it, it kind of moved around in a way that it wasn't just reflecting the light, or it wasn't just a thing in my eye. And then it zipped off. And she's
had some kind of intelligence behind it.
Right. And she's like, it had to be an orb, which we always make fun of because people always take pictures of orbs and be like, it's my grandfather, he's back. And you're like, it's a lens flare.
Well, if you saw it with your own eyes is one thing, like, because you know how you always see these videos on the internet and they're showing these orbs and it's almost always an infrared camera. And I
Right.
have a security system at my house. So I know that anytime the dust blows up here in the desert, you get little millions of orbs. And if they fly right by the camera, it looks really like something's there, but it's really just infrared light bouncing off. So if there's no camera and you see something in real life, it's kind of hard to explain that away.
Right. Well, so the thing is, she sees that, and then she calls me 2 days later, and she goes, "I had to call you and tell you about it. I really saw something." And she goes, "The funny thing is that after I saw it, I forgot about it for a while." And she goes, "I didn't think about it again till today." And normally, when you have an experience, you kind of think about it right. You're like, "Holy crap!" You think about it right away, or you want to tell people right away. I remember when I saw that shadow figure, I told everybody I knew. Like the next day, I called my sister, and I'm like, because she was older than I was, so she was already out of the house, and I'm like, "I saw some shit last night." You know, just like I'm like, it's on. Like I'd never had something like that happen before. And it's interesting. She's like, "I just kind of forgot about it." And I was talking to a guy from Toronto at a convention. We were at a convention in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. So all the way up by the border. And he comes out and he tells me it's him and his husband or whatever. And they're camping and they wake up in the middle of the night and look outside their tent and they see lights like it looks like the stars are moving. And he's like, "We watched it for about a half an hour."
There's somebody in the audience that actually I know that's in there right now that told me this same trip about the stars dancing. They didn't know what to think about it.
Yeah.
Like UFO, drones, what is it?
And he said, he's like, they watched it for a while and then they went back to sleep. And he said they thought it was kind of weird at the time, but they didn't talk about it again for like 2 weeks. And then he's like, yeah. And then like a couple of weeks later, we're like, "Do you remember watching those stars dance in the middle of the night?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, I do." He's like, "Weird, huh?" Just that's what I mean by that particular thing is like when you if I feel like if I had an experience where I saw something like that, I would either try to tape it or I'd call everybody. I'd call the National Guard. I'd be like, "Hey, the stars are dancing. We got to do something." It's, like they're here. Um, and my sister who had an experience and like said she didn't even think about it for 2 days. It's those little things where you're like, what about that kind of made you forget for a little while?
Yeah, that's weird. It's almost like a repressed memory for a short time until like you had time to process it.
Right. Like you were like the Men in Black did got you with the red light or whatever. That,
Yeah.
that little kind of thing. Like, why would you forget about that? Well, it's maybe because maybe because the fairies didn't want you to remember. That's
Yeah, right.
why. And it's just those little things that are, you know, um, a friend of mine named John Tenney says, what you think is weirder than you think. And I think that is a great way of expressing it, that, we think we have some kind of a little bit of grasp on these topics. And it probably goes a lot weirder or more incomprehensible than we're programmed for, than we can comprehend right now, at least in our understanding of how the world works and how the universe works. And so it's fun to talk about these things and then find connections between other people's stories. And it's when you find the connections and then you see the similarities in paranormal experience from this is a Bigfoot sighting, this is a UFO sighting, this is a ghost sighting, this is, all these stuff put together, but there are commonalities in all of them.
Yeah.
And then you think, okay, from Bigfoot to the Slender Man, we're now, it seems like our old explanations of what these experiences are no longer holding enough water for us. So then we have to rethink how we think about them to try to have them meet the new evidence. And so that's, I think that's what's exciting about what we do in the podcast. And, and that's where it's fun to find inspiration from music through that.
Well, in closing, is there anything you'd like to say? And here, let me screen share your website with all your podcasts on it for everybody.
Sure. And so
I didn't do it. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
Here we go. Yeah, so there's a whole plethora of topics and discussions right here, and music. You got a bunch of music on here.
Absolutely. So
It's a
every
pretty awesome
episode.
site. I'm glad I came across your media on Twitter.
Thank you. And so I would just say to anybody, if you guys have a cool kind of experience that you want to share, feel free to contact us at the websites, othersidepodcast.com. Come and say hi sometime. Take a listen. It's new material every week, and we have a couple hundred episodes. And I try to write some show notes that describe it, that like summarize what we talk about, but also make you want to listen to a full conversation with somebody who usually has something pretty interesting to say. And so like this last week, we just interviewed a woman, Sylvia Schultz, who's got these ghost stories from this place called the Illinois Asylum for the Incurably Insane. And what we think of asylums or sanitariums, she takes the notion, it's on its head. And it's how most of these spirits have positive experiences. Instead of being tortured by the staff or whatever, that actually they were treated humanely. And it now in death, at least the paranormal experiences people have had there, instead of being terrifying, they are positive. And it's those little things where there's the popular narrative of the way things are, and then there are people who are introducing things that turn that narrative on its head or a little bit sideways. And those are the things we like to find that see you on the other side.
Yeah, and I suggest you guys go check it out, because I was checking out the podcast last night, and it's a real cool, friendly, smooth conversation type thing, like almost like a morning show, almost like a radio show, except for you guys are doing all kinds of cool topics.
Right. It's like your morning zoo, but with but with demonology.
Yeah. Right. Awesome. Hey, I want to appreciate you coming on 420 TV. And you know what? I'd love to have you come back on again sometime. We'll wait a little while and let you stock up some stories again. I had a real fun time listening to your stories, and I'm sure everybody else did.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving.
All right. You too, man. Here, let me stop the live.